Welcome back. Welcome back to another session. I hope you were well. In today's session, I'm going to be speaking to what I believe is the final part of how to assess a man's value. I started this conversation some time ago, and over the past few sessions, I have tried to address, from a female's perspective, some words of advice and insight as to how a woman can ascertain or estimate a man's value. But more so, what I consider to be interesting, you might consider those as useful selection criteria for ensuring that the man she selects is of sufficient caliber, sufficient value to match what she's giving or offering in exchange. Whether you are a man or a woman, we all feel, we all think, we all believe that fair exchange is perhaps should be the minimum standard. That both parties should either come to the table and leave the table feeling that they have received in exchange for what they have given something to be considered as fair. Hence the term fair exchange does not equal robbery. Now, it doesn't mean equal exchange, it means just simply fair. Now, if we can move from fair to equal, then that is even better. A zero-sum game is where you have one party win at the expense of the other. You get that in many a times in dating, because dating is primarily short-term or medium-term. It's all about getting what you want. When you're seeking a relationship, what you want is a positive sum game or positive sum experience. Because you intend to be with the person for a long time, you want to ensure that they are happy to be there as well, and that what both of you have received as part of the value exchange is consistent with what has been promised and what has been delivered. Today's session will deal with what I call a man's economic intrinsic value. The acronym for that is EIV, economic intrinsic value. Fundamentally, this is how most people assess a man's value in the marketplace. You've heard me talk about the different roles that a man plays over his entire lifetime and how he's conditioned and trained and groomed to prepare for that opportunity to serve. Provision and protection. Provision and protection is combined into one. I call those the two P's. In the West, we have solved most of the issues with regards to safety, and therefore the whole issue about protection is no longer necessary or needed to the same degree as it was, say, in the 1920s or 1930s or pre the 20th century. We provide protection in many ways as a, you might say, provision can serve as a proxy for protection by virtue of the fact that you can afford a better neighborhood, you can afford a better car, you can afford to live in a location where there is lower crime rates, lower incidences of either abuse, attacks, violence. You can afford to live in a country where your children and your loved ones are protected by virtue of the outsourcing of the protection expectations individuals provided, which has then been outsourced into a collective. The police therefore provide some level of protection. The fact that we are educated means that we don't behave like animals. Therefore, people are more safe around each other. So, provision therefore has served as this benchmark that most people have used to assess a man's value. Now, if you listen to any of the sessions that I covered over the past few sessions, I hope you would understand that there are two other values that I consider higher, and I hold in more esteem than a man's economic intrinsic value. The first had to do with him coming into his purpose. I consider that to be more important than all the other P's. Purpose, provision, protection, priestly role, and professing his love. Purpose, for me, fundamentally the most important. Then I talked about a different aspect of a man's value, which is his character value. His character value comes second, is the foundation upon which he builds his entire life and upon which you will build a life with him. Then husband value. Was he trained, prepared to be a husband, to be a loving father, to be kind and gentle and nurturing to you? The others follow: sexual marketplace value and reproductive fertility value. But, in many ways, the first two or the first three undergird a man's purpose significantly in my eyes. We then place the economic intrinsic value alongside, once we have laid the foundation. And here's the key part of what I will share today. If making money is the only thing a man has to do, and if he doesn't have the right foundation, whether that be moral, or whether that be integrity, or whether that be a value system that ensures that he separates finding or getting money into what is acceptable from a societal perspective and what is appalling and abhorred from a societal perspective. If he cannot do that separation, then in many ways what you find that a thief will rob a bank just to provide food for his loved ones. Someone will scam, steal, get involved in illegal activities because the ultimate aim and goal is money. For me particularly, and this is my subjective perspective, I do not hold the position that money can be generated without reference to its source. Now, I know money is spent in the same manner. However, I'm very particular about integrity and how the sins of the fathers are left to the kids, and that sin and in many ways the transgression that comes with such behavior and the recompense have to be paid back by the children even up until the third and fourth generation. And you can avoid all of that if you have good character and if you are raised properly. So, as I start today's session, let me start by making it very, very clear. I'm not suggesting in any way that a man's economic intrinsic value should not be put through the lens of what we consider to be the character value. It has to be fundamentally, because it matters how and where the money is raised from. But putting aside morality and value judgment or judgment of value, and simply looking at what the term economic intrinsic value means. In a nutshell, it simply says, what is his productivity level? How productive is he? Now, I hope you can see that from the jump, from the word go, from the start position, all men are not equal and all men are not created equal. The young man who starts the adult journey at 18 cannot be expected to be able to provide to the same extent as a man who's had 20 years post his 18th birthday. Just cannot. So to assess a young man at 18 in the same manner or have the same expectations as you would a man who's 38 is wrong. In any case, economic intrinsic value comes from productivity, but in this particular instance, I should make very clear that you cannot mistake activity for productivity. Some people go around working. Some of the hardest working people I know are the poorest paid. They have the least wealth. You can dig a ditch all day, and that's manual labor, and you might be a great person, but relative to the law of compensation, which states that you're compensated in proportion to 1, the need for what you do, 2, your ability to do it and do it exceptionally well, and 3, the level of difficulty there will be in replacing you. If there is a need for what you do and you can do it exceptionally well, and that need is needed, you will find that if you're difficult to replace, you will command a higher pay than someone who is easily replaceable. So the first step is actually productivity, but we measure productivity in output, not in input. We do not measure how hard you work. we measure how much you create and what value you create for society. So at the core of a man's economic intrinsic value is his value and his service to the greater community and to the world. Obviously, people have different preferences. Some people prefer entertainment, some people prefer some form of education, some people prefer some form of labor, some people prefer maybe personal services to assist in their lifestyle. Irrespective of that, we measure your output based on what you produce and what you create. So what you've seen here is that a man's economic intrinsic value could be summoned to the same as a country's GDP value, gross domestic product. A country with a high GDP simply means you have very productive citizens and they're creating wealth. A country with a low GDP means you may have more citizens, you're creating less wealth relative to a high GDP country. So economic intrinsic value simply means what is your economic creativity and productivity. The word intrinsic then comes in very, very nicely, because for something to have intrinsic value and for a man to have intrinsic value in this particular regard, I am referring to inherently the free cash that he's able to generate. That could be over his lifetime, that could be on an annual basis, or that could be in the period that he has been an adult. From an economic perspective, that is his economic intrinsic value. Now, the question, therefore, for a woman will be, how do I measure this? How is it possible for me to know whether a man who is pursuing me has the required economic intrinsic value? I'll go back to what I said many sessions ago. Perhaps let me segue. I think this is an important segue, and talk about something that is no longer part of societal norms, but serve the purpose. Many years ago, sometimes centuries ago, there was something called the dowry. The dowry was simply a token gesture provided. Now, the dowry has evolved over time. If you go all the way back to the days of, let's say, Isaac, for those who are scholars, you will find actually that upon arrival, the servant of Isaac, representing Isaac, went looking for a wife for his master, but went with gifts. And upon arrival and meeting the parents, he presented gifts to her. Then he presented gifts to her father. Then he presented gifts to her brothers and sisters and the rest of the family. The gifts presented were a token. The token was to signify, for example, if you provided gold, it was supposed to suggest that perhaps you were a man of means. If you provided flock, it was supposed to suggest that perhaps you were well-to-do. In any case, the gift you provided was a token gesture to reveal the overall wealth and the generosity that the family had come with. Yes, the dowry evolved over time, so much so that time came when people had to exchange between one family and another family to the father. But in any case, it wasn't a purchase per se. It was simply a suggestion that we can afford to cater and look after your daughter to the same extent as you have, sometimes even greater. And so when a dowry request is put forward, many years ago I heard of a story. A man arrived to marry a young woman who was still, we have parents, many, many years ago. An American true story. And the father looked at him and said, I want you to go back and go away. You come back with $1 million, and then you can have my daughter. Now, this was in the United States. I'll have to think about the name, but true story. Now, he loved this girl so much that he decided, no problem. So he went away, and a few years later, he arrived back, and he had the bag, and he walks up to the father, introduced himself, said, "You remember me? I met you." So the father invited him into the family house. So he goes in, he places a table, on the table, this huge bag, and then he says, that's the money, $1 million. The father opens the bag and sees the money, and he smiles. And he says to the young man, you can take my daughter, but you can also take your money with you. I only wanted to make sure that the person who would be marrying my daughter had the fortitude and the ability to do whatever it would take to ensure that she could be looked after. So he left with the money and the daughter and with the blessing. In any case, the reason I make reference to this is to simply say, with regards to women and choosing a man, the measurement approach might be harder than you might think. The dowry was a way for the men of the community or the group to initially assess who they were giving their daughter to. The dowry played a part when the person marrying came from a different community. But when we lived in communities within each other, it was easy to know the family. You knew how many goats they had. You knew how many chickens they had. You knew how many cows they had. You knew how many pieces of land they had. The village knew who had and what they had. But when people came from outside, it was a sign, a symbol. Isaac's servant journeyed from one part of the country to another. So he was not known. At least he was not known within that proximity because they had been away for such a long time. So the key question is, how do you measure a man's economic intrinsic value? Income, a man's earnings, how much he earns, gross, is used as a proxy. So you see how people say, I make £70,000, £100,000, £200,000, £34,000, or in whatever denomination of currency, fiat currency, that it might apply to. That is gross. I do not use such measurement standards. I use something different. I go back to the word intrinsic. Intrinsic, if you were thinking about a business, a company's intrinsic value or an asset's intrinsic value is simply the present value of all of the cash the business will generate, the asset will create over its entire lifetime. So we simply bring forward to the present all of the cash flow, not the revenue, cash flow. We deduct all of the costs and expenses, and we allow for just the cash flow calculations. In other words, how much money can you count at the end? The present value of the future cash flow is a company or an asset's intrinsic value. Similarly, a man's intrinsic value is intrinsically connected to his productivity on an output basis, but we do not measure output by what he earns on paper. We calculate productivity and output based on what he gets. Not how much money you earn, but how much money he gets to keep. For example, if a man makes £200,000 but pays half of that in taxes, we don't calculate £200,000, although the ability to earn £200,000 means, in a very simple basis, that he can borrow possibly £220,000 based on his earnings, or 240, or even sometimes 3 times his earnings. So he might have lines of credit that enable him borrow more, which would then possibly, if invested properly, boost his net worth. In any case, I focus on cash flow because that's all I can measure, cash. I use cash flow and net worth as 2 basic methods for checking a man's intrinsic value. So, to put it more simply for a woman, you meet a man and you want to find out his economic intrinsic value. It's quite simple. Now you can start with his earnings. You can say, how much do you earn? Let's say he says, I make £50,000. You have to do in your head a calculation to adjust for the cash flow, because he may not be able to tell you. So let's say he made £50,000 but paid roughly, give or take 30% of that in taxes. That would mean 50 less 30 would mean perhaps his take home is about, after taxes only, about 35. When you've adjusted for all of his expenses, all of the things he has to buy, all of the demands and money owed to other people, you might come down, although he makes an after tax of 35, his actual take home is actually 20,000. Perhaps maybe because he has student debt, a lot of credit card debt, a lot of other obligations contractually, and all of those people get paid before he has money left. Now, you haven't even adjusted for his accommodation or mortgage, his other expenses. You've just simply said, let's pay off everyone who is contractually owed. What is left? So you calculate in this particular instance that, in this instance, his cash flow, his free cash flow, not his after-tax cash flow, after all obligations are paid, that could be 20,000, but his actual free cash flow, who knows, could be 10,000 pounds. That is what you calculate, because what you're trying to assess is if you were to pair bond with this person, do they have the means and the ability to provide for you? Recognizing that at the moment you pair with them, all of the old obligations will still have to be paid before yours, because in your case, what you get is the residual value left, not the contractual, because you have no contractual obligation with the person. Everyone else has a contractual obligation with him, signed a lease, a rental agreement, a credit card statement, a mortgage, and the debt. The taxman, they all have obligations that are contractually based. Therefore, they get paid first. When he is paid everything, whatever is left is the residual cash flow from his earnings, which is what you get to participate in the sharing. So if he makes £50,000 annually, but only has £10,000 annually left, it simply means, technically speaking, what he has access to, or what you have access to, is £800 and 33. £833 is all he has every month. And that is what you should use to calculate his intrinsic, his economic intrinsic value. Now, if out of the £10,000 annually, he's able to save only, in this instance, 10%, because the remaining 90% is also spent. Shopping, groceries, and all the various things, transportation, fuel, etc. It means he only has £1,000 annually every year. If he spent all of the money, then he'll be almost at a state of running a deficit should he spend over by just one penny. So what you have, therefore, is you go from £50,000, and when he's paid everything, all he has left is £1,000. That £1,000 then becomes, in this instance, his free cash flow after all expenses, obligations, payments have been met. That's all he has. Technically speaking, that becomes his savings. That cash moves into what we call the balance sheet. If he accrues £1,000 every month, after 10 years he has £10,000. If it's in a savings account, that becomes his net worth. So 10 years from now, he has a net worth of £10,000, plus he's still earning a certain amount every single month. So can you see that there are two parts of how you assess a man's economic intrinsic value? The free cash flow, which is the money generated on an adjusted basis within a time period, and the accrued savings, whether that be credit or debit. So if he earns if he saves £1,000, after 10 years, he has £10,000. But if he spends all of the money and borrows £500, but continues to borrow £500 for the 10-year period, then at the end of the 10 years, he owes £5,000. Let's start with that basic premise. Now put that aside, because all of these are things that the men of the group are supposed to do on a woman's behalf, which is why the decisions should go through the family in good faith, because the men of the group can ask questions. Usually people ask, what do you do? And I have been asked that question many times. And I have found for some people who are not very either open or who are stuck in the past, or perhaps they're just not financially savvy, they start with questions about what does he do? What do you do? And what do you do used to be a proxy that we used previously to understand whether a man had the resources or the ability to provide for a family. So if he said, I'm a doctor, then we would simply say, well, doctors make a reasonable amount of money, providing he was raised properly and doesn't have too much debt and doesn't have too many obligations, and doesn't owe a lot of people money. He should have enough funds to look after a family and my daughter. Things have evolved. We live in a service economy these days, and there are people making money in several ways. So except you're very learned and open and educating yourself, you will find that you struggle to understand that what people do does not necessarily mean that that would give them wealth or give them a high cash flow. You have to go down to the key questions. What is your free cash flow? And what is your net worth? Remember, what you accrue becomes your net worth. If you take all of your liabilities and you subtract from all of your liabilities, from your assets, all of your liabilities, you get your net worth. So in addition to earning, say, £1,000 a month over 10 years, he has £10,000 in cash. However, if he then has a house, and the house is worth £50,000, or rather, the price in the market is £50,000, but he has a debt that is £50,000, then he effectively owes more than he owns by the fact that there are obligations on the house, such as perhaps tax considerations, whatever that amount might be. But if he breaks even, if the value of his assets is exactly the same as the value of his debts, then there's a net of zero. But he owes, because, for example, should he choose to sell that house, there'll be transaction costs. There'll be costs associated with professionals who help him sell the house, which he will owe. Therefore, the liquidated value of the house will be less than the actual loan amount, in which case he will have a negative net worth. You take that negative net worth, let's assume it's £10,000 negative, you add it to his £10,000 positive, you then have zero. Now that is how you accrue to your net worth position. In other words, what is the liquidated equity? Not net worth on paper. It has to be based on liquidation value. In other words, if you sold everything and you liquidated all of the money in the account and you paid all the people you owed, whether that be the taxman or the professionals who helped you go through that process of getting your wealth either transferred from yourself to another, what would be the balance? That is your liquidated net worth. Or, to put it more clearly, an owner's equity, the balance left. Women, therefore, might struggle, which is why the men of the group, the men who support her, should be the ones who are asking questions, because they can do the numbers very quickly and they can say, listen, baby, we know what you want. We know the lifestyle you want, but we do not think that he can meet that lifestyle currently. He might be able to meet the lifestyle based on his lifetime value, which is why I said an asset's value is the present value of his free cash flow. A man's economic intrinsic value is the present value of all of the cash flow he will earn during his lifetime. Someone might start off with £50,000 earning gross salary, but that could increase. To 100,000 in 2 years, and then keep increasing over a 30-year period from 100 to maybe 250,000, which means his earning ability increases with time. There are other people who might make £50,000 or even £70,000 and never go beyond £80,000 over a 30-year lifetime, which would mean on an adjusted basis, the first person is better off. While although he starts with 50,000, he moves up. So his salary tracks and is adjusted to inflation, but also has a growth potential that far exceeds, you might say, the inflation rate. Whereas the other person might earn more at the start, but not increase over his or her lifetime. Now let me push all of that to the side and move to the second part, which is, okay, there has to be a proxy. There has to be a process and a methodology that is used to understand whether the person you're dealing with has the potential or has the ability or is already achieving what you desire. Think about when I talk about a man's sexual marketplace value, I made reference to the fact that men are visual. In this particular instance, a woman has to be visual. We go to the visuals. Now let me take you back in time. And I'm taking you back over 20 years, 2 decades. In 2002, LinkedIn was created. It was formed. 2003, it was made public from the perspective that it was launched. It was still a private company, but it was launched. Between 2002 and 2006, there were so many changes. Private accounts, people had opportunities to register accounts. It went from 0 to 1 million users, and several great things were happening. But 2008, if I recall, was when you started to see shifts. 2006, 2005, 6, companies were given membership accounts, because initially it was just people registering themselves and saying, this is me, this is who I am. LinkedIn was supposed to be similar to the Facebook, but for those who were professionals. Now, anybody can come out and say, well, I work for General Motors, I work for AstraZeneca. But until you have the company in that particular platform with a public profile, it was hard to link the company to the individuals. 2008 was when you had something that was called people you know. In other words, this was similar to Facebook, where people who were there already as members could search for people they knew and connect with them. But more importantly, the people who had registered could connect with their company's profile, so that you would have your name, your profile, and the company's profile linked to yours. And therefore, you could then see if everybody in the company created a profile, it would automatically sort people out into a hierarchy. Visibility. The visibility provided an opportunity for clarity about what you did, clarity for the source of your wealth or your income, confirmation that you were what you said you were, provided opportunity for group approval, provided a confirmation of a hierarchical position. So you could say, well, make it more clear. I work for XX hedge fund and I'm the portfolio manager. And then another person would say, well, I work for XX hedge fund and I'm the director of finance. I'm the director of capital allocation. And you would see portfolio manager, director. You would then see other things such as executive members or executive officers. You see things such as equity analyst. You might see associate, and all of those, investment director, all sitting underneath the portfolio manager. So you could then say, okay, I can see this. This XX hedge fund, the boss there is the portfolio manager or chief investment officer. And he has all these other people working for him. And they have in total, based on the company profile, 20 people working. Interesting. So he manages 20 people. Interesting. That is the source of his funds. That is the source of his capital. He gets the group approval because people are connecting and sharing. He connects with other clients and other people. So there's clarity and visibility about what he does. You have connectivity, therefore, between people and within a group. You have influence by virtue of the fact that you log on and you see portfolio manager, XX hedge fund. He has influence because when he shares, either goes to a keynote event and speaks, the first thing people say is, what's his name? And they search. And as soon as they see his name and they search, and they say, okay, he's a portfolio manager. And he's talking about finance and investing. And he might be taking a contrarian view, but they say, his company has 2.5 billion on the assets under management, or 20 billion under management. Automatically, that gives him credibility, gives him influence. It gives him a status hierarchy, because suddenly you have on stage 10 or 11 speakers, and the person who takes a very contrarian view is the one who manages the biggest, you might say, portfolio of assets. Suddenly, those who are in the audience can listen and simply say, oh, well, the fact that he actually manages this much and is connected with all of these clients and has all of these people working for him must mean that he has a level of productivity that outshines most people. Now let's put that to the side, because I think that's a key part. A woman has to be able to say, well, I met this guy. He tells me what he does. He tells me who he is. If he's on LinkedIn, you can see him, you can see his status, and then you get confirmation. Now there are several other ways that you can get that information. You can ask for his pay slips. You can ask for his bank details. You can ask to see his net worth. The men in the group and of your family should be asking these questions. Any man who is asking for your hand in marriage should be able to demonstrate that he can look after you long term, not just short term. Plus, the ability to be able to increase that wealth over time. I'd like to move to the third part of today's session, and perhaps this is where it gets quite interesting. If you live in the West, any part of the Anglosphere, one of the things that has become a norm, it never used to be the case a decade ago, but one of the things that has become more of a norm is earnings. How much does he make? Money has become such a forward factor in dating. So much so that people don't ask any other questions. What is his character like? Does he have a sense of meaning and purpose and identity? Was he raised to be a husband? Did he come from a two-parent family? We go straight to how much money does he make? We've made money almost a god, that we judge men based on who makes the most. We don't ask questions such as, what was the source of the funds? Does he have the visibility? Does he have the status within the group? Is he considered to be a legitimate earner, as opposed to someone who just does something shady, robs a bank, does some fraud activities, etc., etc. The reason this is key and important, and why you should distinguish and discriminate on capital, is because if the person is involved in very shady deals, if you get married to a man who is doing shady deals, at the moment of your marriage, you become a 50% partner in whatever he is. You're liable for half of his liabilities, just in the same way you are own half of his assets, and vice versa. So one of the key things is to understand who you're pair bonding with, and whether they are clean, whether they have enemies, whether the source of their funds is legit. If it's an armed robber, someone who steals, then that could affect you. Suddenly, your children have no father. Why? Because he's gone into, a great example was the movie Heat. We had 4 men. On a normal day, you would see them in the grocery stores and the supermarkets interacting, and they looked like very normal men, until it was time to go and rob a bank. And sometimes one of them died, or most of them died, or none of them died. But the point being that the way money is earned matters. That said, in the UK, the median income in the United Kingdom, despite what we hear about, and despite all of the high demands that women have about a man's ability to earn, is £34,000. That equates to roughly £16 an hour, 16.5, 16.17 pounds an hour, if you want to push it that far. Median. Last year was 34. I think by the end of 2022, the projected number, 2023, 2022 was 34,000. I think the year before it was 32,000. This year, it's projected that perhaps it could be adjusted for inflation, could be less. But in any case, I'm talking about notional value, so inflation doesn't make a difference. £34,000. So 17 pounds an hour is the median. Median simply means, we use median, not average, because if you have outliers on the extreme, say you have someone making £1 million and someone making, say, £2,000 per year, you have 2 outliers that skews the entire distribution. So we use median wherever you have outliers, and it makes a big difference when you use median, because effectively you're simply saying, I lop out that and I take out that and I look at what's in between. Median is a better number whenever you have extremes to either side. Average is when perhaps you have a smaller size, but the size and the numbers being measured are more evenly distributed. So for example, if you had something like 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, you can see that you have 2 and you have 10. 2 extremes. But if you had something similar to 5, 5.5, 6, 6.8, 7, the variations are much more narrow, in which case you can use the average rather than the median, especially in a smaller sample set. In any case, the median income in the UK is 34,000. This is where I start to give some more specific recommendations and detail. That has to be adjusted for location. If you're in the north, say Scotland, that might be good money. If you are in the north Wales, North Wales, that could be good money. If you're South Wales, suddenly you're closer to the action, which is closer to southeast of England, so southwest of England rather, and the heart of the greater United Kingdom. That may not go as far, so it has to be adjusted. If you're in the Midlands, you might find some adjustment is needed. If you're just on the north of England, that might be good money. You come into London, Greater London, southeast, southwest, and you find that 34,000 doesn't go quite very far, so some adjustment is needed. In any case, we simply say £34,000. This simply means that if you're assessing a man's value, remember, that is income, that is not cash flow. But if you were to use the income as a proxy and simply say, well, I'd like to see if he earns, and let's say you're based in Angus, in Scotland, and let's say you meet a guy who makes £40,000, and let's assume in this particular instance, he's 25, going on 26. You would simply say, what is the median age of men in Scotland or Angus? In the UK, the median age is roughly about 30, I think it's 38, if I'm correct. 38. I think in Scotland, it's probably 38, 39. So if you meet a young man and he's 25, making above the median income, 40,000 he earns, you might say, well, he earns above the median, and therefore he's above average, considering his age, because by age adjusting to what will be the median age in Scotland, if he simply increases income by 2% every single year, it could easily mean that by the time he is 38, which is 13 years into the future, he easily could be making 60,000 or 65,000 pounds, which would make him far above, in today's terms, maybe he's earning twice today's median. So he's doing well. But remember, I said I do not use income. I simply use cash flow and net worth. 35 is the age that I think women should keep in mind when assessing men's intrinsic value. A boy who's 18, a young man who's 25, is still far too young to be expected to earn so much money. Way too young, way too inexperienced for him to be placed under that much pressure. 35. 18 to 22 is college. We're still dependent on our parents. As a matter of fact, most people need 2 years after college to become independent, which is why when I deal with younger men or younger women, I generally speaking, I don't care very much for people 25 and younger. Why? 18 to 22, you're still in college, fully dependent on mom and dad. The first 2 years after graduating, although you're fully working as an adult, you're still dependent on mom and dad. But it's only from about 25 that people actually become emancipated economically, financially, mentally, and even physically from their parents. So 25 is where we even stop counting. In any case, between 25 and 35, we have just over 10 years, which is a good marker to give men enough time to be able to earn something, create wealth. Assuming we go back to the basic median income, £34,000. If a man saved 10% of his gross income every year, that'll be 30,400. If he did that in the first 5 years, that is great, because it simply means he's been saving 30,500 every single year. 5 years, he has 17,000. That is good because it shows discipline, focus, long-term plan. He can save, and he is saving 10% of his gross, which will translate to almost 20% of his after tax, but before expenses and obligations, which is very, very good. That's a great sign of a man who has long-term wealth creation in mind. Now he has to move from saving to investing. But the first 5 years, he should simply save. But at 35, I would expect the man at 35 to have made roughly £60,000 in net worth as a minimum. Why? Well, just do the numbers. You could do it very simply. How much would you save in the first 5 years of your earnings? Between, say, 23 and all the way up to 35. The first 5 years is just savings, £17,000. The next 8 years will be money you invest. Same amount. We're not increasing it. same amount but invested in an investment account, compounded at roughly 10% over that 8-year period, we come back to £58,000 to be precise, which is why I used £60,000. So at 35, £60,000 in net worth is a useful marker for a man. That means if you're 27, assuming you age gap 8, and he's 35, he has £60,000. He might be able to provide a deposit for a home to start nesting. £60,000 is the marker. A man who has more than £60,000 is way above average from my perspective. A man who has less is slightly below average, depending on where he falls within that hierarchy. So what you find is actually that 35 as a benchmark means you've given the man some time to actually go out into the world and make something of himself and earn some money and save and invest, which are interesting markers of what his future net worth could be, but more importantly, what the present value of all the cash flow he has made and kept and invested would amount to. It's not what you earn as a man that matters, it's what you keep. What you keep is what matters to the woman, not what you make. You might make £200,000 a month, but if you spend 250, it means you're in debt. It means that she, in choosing you, is liable for half of the debt that you owe. Go back to the point I'm trying to make. £60,000 net worth. Now, keep in mind that I said net worth. I did not say savings or just savings and investments. Net worth, which simply means I am not attaching to that amount debt. I expect his, you might say, net debt position from the perspective of the value of all assets, without including cash, should exceed all of his liabilities. So I expect at 35, 0 student loan debt. If there are any debts, such as good debts, a property and investment, that the value of the property or investment or asset exceeds the value of the liabilities, so that you're not taking the £60,000 he's earned and drawing that down by another £60,000 of student debt. Always pay attention, ladies, to a man's net worth, and you should be able to ask and have a list of all of his liabilities. A man can earn £1 million, but if his liabilities amount to 10 million, then it doesn't matter how much he earns. What you have is a working slave. He might be making £1 million, but he has to make that to pay off all the creditors. And there is nothing left for you or for the kids. This is a time bomb waiting to blow up. So decide, what do you want? Do you want a flashy high earner? Or do you want a man who's disciplined, who has good financial knowledge, who's financially intelligent, who is actually resourceful, who has the value of compounding in his mind, the seventh wonder of the world, and can compound wealth, starting from as little as possible and building that over the years? Recognize 10% is all he's saving, and then all he is investing. But what you also want is a man who has the ability to increase that over time. For example, he's saving 10% every year in the first 5 years. Then he increases that to 15%, then 20%, and 25%, whilst at the same time increasing his earning ability. Now, if you notice, I don't pay too much attention to gross income. I pay more attention to how much you keep rather than how much you make. I don't care if you make £100,000 and then 120 and then 130 and then 140. If at the moment you're making 100, you're spending 99, and when you're making 120, you're spending 112, and when you're making 150, you're spending 140. You effectively are increasing your spending to match your income. I would prefer a man who makes £50,000, but only spends in total 30, therefore keeps 20, and next year he makes £50,000 and he keeps the same, and the following year he makes £55,000, but he increases his net saving and investing by a small percentage every year. Why? Because he can compound his wealth. Now, take everything I've shared as I bring today's session to a close. And what you might be asking is, well, how does this really help me? I'm going to talk about a concept that I've used many a times, which is begin with the end in mind. Start with the end. The reason I went through the process of giving you numbers and narratives is simply to paint a picture to help you decide whether the person you're interviewing, considering, talking to, exploring options with, can meet that standard. Every woman should begin with the end in mind. I started today's session by talking about begin with the present. Look at his free cash flow and his net worth today. But as a woman, and let's use this simple example, let's say you're 25 and you intend to be married at 27 and you're getting into the sexual dating marketplace and you want to find a husband. You're dating with the intention to get married. You want to be married in 2 years, but you also want to be married and have the opportunity to have a family. We start with your lifestyle that you want to lead, the outcomes you want, and the goals you have. Let's assume you're going to be 27 when you start to have your first child, and your intention is to have 3 kids, and you're going to have them in a spaced arrangement, like stairs. Not 1, 2, 3, but giving yourself time to enjoy the process. 1, 3, 5, or 1, 4, 6, or 1, 2, 6. But you give yourself a number of years. At the moment the child is born, you intend to nurse the child and look after the child. If you're going to have 3 kids, and you wait until preschool, the child has to get to about 3 or 3.5, 4. That would mean you add 4 to the last child, and the 5 years that you'll be out of work. So you have 5 years of childbearing. Wait until 3.5, 4 for the last child to be able to be old enough to go out, to be cared for and looked after by other people. So you're looking at roughly 8 to 9 years. We'll round it up to 10 years as a rounded number. It means you'll be out of work for 10 years. Now, it doesn't matter what you have done or what you do, your education, your earnings, your net worth, doesn't matter, because you will not be working at that point in time. By beginning with the end in mind, you're simply saying in 10 years' time, I want to have a family, 3 kids, a husband that can look after all of us. So you're looking for a man who can look after 5 people, including himself. Remember, you're 25. You're starting the process at 27. So technically speaking, you're simply saying, I need a man and his present value and present earning ability and his free cash flow and net worth has to be such that he can look after 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people in the period of time that you want to have all of those. Now, 10 years, you're not going to work, you're not going to contribute. So we begin with that end and we simply say, roughly London. We use London because London is a useful place to start. It will not apply to everybody, but it's still a useful number. 5 kids. We say, okay, great. Where do you want to live? Now you might decide, well, I've always lived around central London. I lived in the Bayswater area, Westminster, somewhere in central London. Who knows, maybe you might even go as far as Maida Vale. You might go as far as parts of Regent Street. By choosing those locations you want to live in, you're choosing a location and a lifestyle. You're choosing houses around Mayfair, Bayswater, Camden, houses around West Hampstead. These are very affluent areas. Very few men can afford to live there. On the other hand, if you moved out, and let me finish that line of thought, a family of 5, every child has a bedroom, so you need 3 rooms for the children, a master bedroom for both of you, and a spare guest room, obviously for mum and grandpa and grandma to visit. So a 5-bedroom house, effectively a townhouse. Let's just simply say it's a Georgian townhouse. Georgian townhouse, give or take, floor area, 220 square meters, 3 stories, depending on where you choose, maybe even 4. What will be the cost of a house as such? Well, you're looking at roughly between 6 to 10, depending on the area. Could go up to 15 or even 20 million pounds because of the location. So he has to have a house. net worth that can afford a house like that. So you're looking for a man who actually has net worth at least £10 million before his earnings to sustain all of the other expenses. This is just for shelter, and then there's all the other expenses. Usually people's mortgages or rental will be responsible for about 35 to sometimes 40% of their earnings. Whether he has a mortgage or he pays outright, what we're simply saying is that you're looking for a man who can afford to pay in cash completely outright a house worth about £10 million, which means that's about a third. So he needs about 3 times that amount to ensure that you guys are looked after completely in net worth. That's £30 million. That's a lot of money. It is a lot of money. I'm quite happy to live in Kilburn. I'm quite happy to live in New Malden. I don't mind. I can go all the way up north. I can live in Enfield. I can go east. I can live in East Ham. Suddenly you can find you can get a decent 5-bedroom house and you're paying about £1 million. In some locations, £860,000. Zone 5, Zone 6, much further away. It becomes more affordable. But in any case, you're still looking for a man who ranges from, depending on where you live in London, 1 million for a home, all the way up to 10 million and more, depending where in central London you would like to live in. The burden of performance on such a man is very high. At 25, if this is what you're demanding in 2 years, you cannot have a man who earns the median income live up to such standards. So by beginning with the end in mind, you can simply say, well, I need a man who has a net worth about 10 million. He doesn't have to have it. I'm happy to start with a 2-bedroom flat. And then the next year when the first child comes, we move into a 3-bedroom flat. And then by year 5, we'll move into a 4-bedroom house. And then year 6, 7, we'll move into a 5-bedroom house. But it's a progressive movement, which means his earnings and his cash flow and his net worth have to grow at a rate of roughly about 15 to 25% annually over that 10-year period to ensure that by year 10, you're provided for from day 1 until the end. That is a concept of beginning with the end in mind. You define the lifestyle you want. You define the life you want to lead, what you want it to look like, and then you start from the end and you simply say, what kind of man will be able to provide me with that lifestyle and that life, and what would he have to earn in present to be able to afford a cash flow that meets X, Y, and Z and have a net worth of A, B, and C. That is the concept of beginning with the end in mind. It's hard to calculate. Back in the day, fathers did that very well. They simply said, what do you do? What does your father do? What is your family's net worth? What is your net worth? Can I go back to the story, I need £1 million. He knows, yeah, he might be able to look after my daughter, providing he didn't steal the money. Now, I should have said before that this particular man in question in the example went out and worked, started businesses, made the money legitimately, and brought back the money. He had receipts for his earnings. A woman starting with the end in mind enables her to come to 2 conclusions. Am I being unfair towards men? Which is usually very likely, because you're expecting too much. And you exclude good men with good character, men who are on their purpose and who live in a purpose-driven life, men who have high husband values, who are trained and raised to be men, sometimes men who are attractive and have high sexual marketplace value and high reproductive fertility value. You exclude great men on the altar of your lofty tastes, no criticism, but your lofty tastes and a lifestyle you want to lead. What that then puts you in a position where you're chasing after some of the top, most desired men in London or the UK who have too much of an abundance to choose from. And what sadly ends up happening is most women become side chicks and number 2s and fun girls because those men have too much to choose from. They have all these women throwing themselves at them, and therefore they can have fun. And they can string most women along. Most women think I might be the one, whilst they dismiss the really good men, kind, loving, kind, nurturing, great men, but they dismiss them based on economic intrinsic value only. And I'm not saying money isn't important. Of course it is. However, here is a very useful stat. In the UK, the research is conclusive. For a household that earns roughly £58,000 annually. We haven't adjusted for London, but we just simply say all other areas, excluding London and the south, west and east, are the expensive parts. In other parts of the country, £58,000 household income, even if she wasn't working and he was the only person working, is good money. Why? You're almost earning double the median income. And what is shown is actually the equivalent of that adjusted is $70,000. Your happiness, your sense of fulfillment, doesn't go up significantly if you earn more than that amount. It's almost intrinsically, use the word unresponsive, is statistically insignificant the more you earn. As a matter of fact, the more you earn, the more problems you actually have. The sweet spot used to be $70,000. Now, since the last 2-3 years with inflation, we adjust and we might call that $90,000 and maybe £70,000, adjusted based on the high inflation rates we've had in recent times. £70,000, a man who makes £70,000 in today's current salary in London or out of London is making great money. I mean, great money. In parts of the UK, depending on where you are, £70,000, that's £6,000 plus. Roughly £6,000, which is £72,000 annually, every month. £6,000. There are parts of the UK where you can have a 4 or 5 bedroom house and you're paying £1,000 per month. That's 1 in 6 of your entire monthly gross, not net, gross salary. It might represent 1 in 4 of your net income after taxes. 25%. Families provided for. 2 cars are there for the family. There's enough room, space for the whole family. You guys are happy, living a great life. Your happiness level does not increase with more money. Now, believe me, take it from the source. Let's put it that way. It doesn't. I have found more happiness when I've had nothing than I had when I had a lot of money. It doesn't make a difference. Because you can only have more than one plate of steak. You can only drive so many cars. You can only sleep on so many beds. You might travel more exclusively. You might actually wine and dine in expensive restaurants. But when 2 people have had red wine, and one has had a 40-year-old bottle of red wine, and the other has had a 6-month-old bottle of red wine, when both of them are tipsy, it makes no difference. Alcohol is alcohol. One tastes better if you have the taste buds for such. For other people, it makes no difference. It's possible these days to live a life that is in keeping with the way normal people should live, without this unnecessary, heavy, high expectations. Now, I make no value judgment. You can want whatever you want. You get to choose. But I hope that today what you've found is, from what I have shared so far, you've taken out some nuggets of how to assess a man's intrinsic value. I think intrinsically connected to what I've shared so far is something that I call AGD, age gap dating. If you're looking for a man making £70,000 and you are 25, hoping to get married in 2 years, you want to be married at 27, then the man who very likely could be in that position to be making such amount of money is more likely going to be about 35. This brings me back to the age gap dating of about 7 years, which is the sweet formula. Between 5 and 10 years age gap dating, in order to give the husband or the man enough time to have made that money, saved that money, invested the money wisely, so that he's had almost a 10-year head start, so that he can meet all of your needs. I hope it's been useful.